Hello, welcome to Lecture 1 of Intro to Music, Music 110. If you haven't seen Lecture 0 yet, there is a Lecture 0 in which I just kind of go over the way the course is structured, go over the syllabus a little bit, what the expectations are, etc. This is Lecture 1 where we're actually going to start talking about the elements of music. And we're going to begin at the beginning with a definition of the word music itself. Now, you might wonder, what's the point of defining a word like music? We all know what music is. Well, coming up with a definition like this, especially of something that you are very familiar with, is actually good intellectual exercise. It forces you to clarify your thinking somewhat. And I think if you were to ask just random people off the street, what is music, you'd probably get a bunch of different definitions. They would probably not pass muster for putting in a textbook or a dictionary. And that's the kind of definition that we're looking for, since we are studying this subject at the college level, not just kind of like, having a chat about it. Now, very often, again, on the subject of these sort of subjective definitions of what music means to people, what it makes them feel, there's usually something about expression. Music is for expressing your emotions through sound. And I would say that's not necessarily always the case. I can imagine music that is not necessarily expressing emotions. For example, I think you could come up with electronic music created by an algorithm that doesn't really express emotions because the machine that created it does not feel any emotions. Now you might say, well, then that doesn't really meet the definition of music because it wasn't created by a human being. And that might be a good counter, actually. And I might say, well, yes, but the human being programmed the computer, directed the computer in such a way as to make the sounds. You might also say, well, music is beautiful sounds. And here we get into a tricky issue because I don't think that there is any common definition of beauty that we could all agree on. There's that famous expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Whether or not you agree with that, I think it's certainly the case that people don't agree on what is beautiful or not. So we can't really just say that music is beautiful sounds. And I think a lot of people create music that is often intentionally ugly or harsh or dissonant because beauty is not maybe the main thing that they're after, right? Probably the definition that bothers me the most, and it's one that I hear a lot, is when people say that music is a universal language. And I would say that music is not a universal language for two important reasons. Number one, it is not universal, and number two, it is not a language. Let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, the word universal, what does that mean? Something which is universal applies to everybody equally. Right? If we have a universal law, it's the law for everybody. It applies all throughout the universe. Right? So for something to be universal, it has to work in the same way for everybody. And I don't think that everybody responds to or understands or experiences music the same way. I mentioned in Lecture 0 when I was talking about the need to understand the historical context of the music that we're studying. Different people in different times, in different places, experience music in different ways because music comes out of that culture. So for example, if you were to go to India and listen to some Indian classical music, and there is a very ancient tradition, a very sophisticated classical music going back thousands of years in India, you might listen to it and you might enjoy it, you might feel certain things, but there's no way you're going to understand that music in the same way that someone who has grown up in that culture understands it. And I think we can see even within our own culture, one generation's music is another generation's noise, right? I don't think we can say that music is universal because it's not experienced the same way by everybody. And it is also not a language. Now, it has some features in common with language. But the most important thing about language, I would say, is that the sounds that I'm making right now as I speak the English language to you, or the the words that you read in the textbook. Those sounds, those squiggles of ink on the page, are encoders of a definite, a more or less definite, specific meaning. So if I say the word cat, or if I write the letters C-A-T on a piece of paper in the English language, as long as you understand the English language, you understand what cat means. You might picture a different cat in your mind than I do. You might picture a black cat. I might picture a white cat, whatever. But you're not picturing a dog or a hippopotamus or a rhinoceros. You're picturing some kind of a cat. And if you're not, then you just don't understand the code. And that's how language works. If it didn't work, we wouldn't be able to understand each other using language. Language encodes specific meanings. And the sounds that I'm making as I'm speaking the language are not the most important thing about it. The sounds are a means to an end. The sounds serve the purpose to encode meaning. The same thing with the squiggles of ink on the page. Right? The squiggles of ink are not important in themselves. They are important for the meaning that they encode. But music is different. And here I'm talking about, let's say, purely instrumental music, just musical sounds themselves, not music that has words. Because obviously if there's words, then the words are doing the job of encoding specific meanings. Musical sounds do not have a specific meaning. Right? So for example, if I play the notes C, E, G on the piano like this, right, that forms a C major triad. It's a thing, it's a technical thing in music that I can describe. In fact, as we will learn later, it corresponds to certain mathematical ratios of the frequencies of those pitches, but it doesn't mean anything. Now, I have to qualify that statement somewhat, because over time, within a culture, as musicians learn from each other and influence each other, and as audiences over generations experience a certain kind of music, you could say that certain musical figures or devices or chords like that C major chord I just played, they can kind of take on association. So for example, if enough composers use major chords consistently to depict, intending to depict a positive mood, happiness, let's say, especially if there are words to go along, to help reinforce the meaning. So if I'm writing a happy song that has happy words, I might use major chords. I might play in a major key. And if enough people do that consistently over time, there will be an association developed in the culture between the sound of major chords and happy stuff. But that's not really in the chords themselves. That's not in the ratios of those notes. It's something that is built up by association, by constant practice within the culture. There's nothing inherently happy about a C major chord. Yet it has this effect on us because we've grown up, those of us who grew up in Western culture, as I'm assuming all of us probably did here, we've grown up associating with happy songs like most Christmas carols. Not all, but most Christmas carols are in a major key. Sort of patriotic, rousing patriotic songs like the Star-Spangled Banner are in a major key. Sad songs are very often in a minor key. So, for example, if you play Happy Birthday, that's in a major key. If I change it to a minor key, I've actually only played a couple of notes different than I otherwise would have if I'd have played it in a major key, but it sounds sad to you, right? So I'm having to hedge myself here a little bit and saying that musical sounds don't have specific meanings, but they over time can be used in such a way, especially in association with words, if there's a text to the musical piece, if it's a song, that you understand the composer's intention, whether they use major or minor chords or various other figures. In fact, we'll see when we get to the Baroque era, which is it's going to be about halfway through the semester, and this is when opera was invented. The genre of opera was invented. And composers developed a very specific sort of language within music of musical figures that were understood by their audiences to represent certain emotional states. This is called the doctrine of affections, this idea, and we'll learn about it later in the semester. But this is also something that is used all the time in movie scores. So, for example, if you hear this kind of like slashing sound, in a horror movie, you know that something bad is about to happen, right? But again, the reason that works is because you have a visual, and because enough filmmakers have done that over time to associate the slashing sound, probably beginning with Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho, that the audience is cued into what is happening, right? But if we take all of that away, if we just look at musical sounds themselves, the sounds don't encode specific meanings. The sounds are treated kind of like as sounds, as an end in themselves, and not just as a means to an end, the way that language is. And this makes music a very sort of abstract art form. That is, again, purely instrumental music where there are no words. Because it is very open to interpretation, the fact that the sounds don't encode specific meanings. So anyway, I've just gone off on that tangent talking about how this idea of music as a universal language is really just not true. Now, I think when people say that, the universal language of music, what they really mean is that everybody likes music. But even that, unfortunately, isn't true. There are some people who don't particularly care for music. There are some places, like Afghanistan, where music is officially banned because it's considered un-Islamic. So, I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but it just kind of makes the point that music is experienced very sort of subjectively. It's dependent on the culture, the time and place that you grow up in. Anyway, let's find the book's definition and see what we think of it. And again, I'm skipping down about 5 paragraphs here on page 5 of the 2025 edition of Camion. And it says at the beginning of this paragraph, it says, music is part of this world of sound, an art based on the organization of sounds in time. So I would say that if I were to have a compact dictionary definition of what music is, that's a pretty good one. Now I'm going to talk about it a little bit further because there are some problems with it, or some issues maybe worth talking about. So, but to restate the definition, music is an art based on the organization of sounds in time. So first of all, an art. So music is an art. Maybe we should define the term art. Maybe not. That's even more difficult to define than music, I think. And again, it's a hotly contested term. I mean, how many times have you seen some work of especially modern art, and someone says that's not art, that's junk. So what is it that makes it art? We should probably avoid that subject. We'll be here all day. But let's just kind of stipulate that music is an art, whatever that is. It is an art based on the organization of sounds in time. So it's not enough just to have sounds, although obviously music requires sounds, right? It's definitely an art that has something to do with sounds. All we have to do is organize sounds. If we intend to organize them, if we take these sounds and we organize them in some artistic way, the result will be music. That's a pretty broad definition, but it's kind of hard to quibble with. Now, I will quibble with it a little bit in a minute, but let's look at this last part of the definition. An art based on the organization of sounds in time. That in time part at the end of the definition, you might look at that and say, well, why is that necessary? Of course, it's in time. Everything in the universe happens in time, right? Time is one of those 4 fundamental elements of the universe, right? We have matter, energy, space, and time, and everything happens in time. So, well, I think what they mean by that is that there's something special about music and a couple of other art forms like dance, where, but music in particular exists in a way only in time. It does not exist in space. Whereas the visual arts, and I'm thinking here of like painting, sculpture, not the movies. The movies exist in both time and space in a way. But the visual arts otherwise exist really in space but not in time. Here's what I mean by that. If you go to a museum and you look at a painting, the painting takes up a certain amount of space. And in fact, that's one of the first decisions that a painter has to make, or a sculptor or whatever, is how much space, how much canvas do I have to work with? And that space is, filled with paint and figures and whatever. And once the painting is done, it doesn't change in time. Now, of course, it can become faded or whatever, but that's not what I'm talking about. As you experience the art when you walk into the museum, there is no movement in time. It is static. Now, a skillful artist might attempt to create the illusion of movement by the way they place the figures or the way that they draw your eye from one part of the canvas down to the other. And as your eye moves from here to there, the figures might appear to move. And this is something that skillful artists do all the time. They might pose the figures in such a way that they're in the middle of moving, and so it suggests motion, but it's really just a suggestion. The visual arts do not exist in time. They remain the same over time. They exist in space. Music, on the other hand, exists pretty much only in time and not in space. Pretty much everything that you experience as you're listening to music has to do with time, and we might say also energy, because it takes a certain amount of energy to get something vibrating to create a sound wave, right? So it's energy and time, but not really space. Every manifestation of music, from the pitch, the highness and lowness of which we'll talk about. It's not even really high and low. It's hard to even talk about music without getting into spatial terms like high and low. There's nothing high about a high note in reality because it's not like up there, whereas the low notes are down there. It's just that we are, the way that our brains are wired, it's much easier for us to talk about things in terms of space, right? Now, when you write musical notes, we write them up higher on the page and we write the lower notes down lower, but in reality, musical notes are neither high or low in space. What that high and low represents is a higher frequency of vibration in time, or a lower frequency of vibration in time. Getting a little bit ahead of myself, I'm going to talk about what frequencies are and how sound works. My main point here is that music exists in time, and all of the aspects of music that we're going to talk about really have to do with time and not space. Even something like, for example, if you go to a concert and or let's say you go into a big cathedral where there's a choir singing or an organ playing, you can hear, even with your eyes closed, the space, right? You can hear that reverberation, right? And you can tell it's a big space. But even that, it's really just a byproduct of the way that the sound waves are echoing off your walls and hitting your ear in time, in a sort of a staggered way. And you could duplicate that effect, obviously, electronically, and not even have to have the big space. Or, for example, this is kind of a fascinating aspect of the way our ears and our brains work in processing sound. You might say, well, wait a minute, I can tell space when I'm listening to music, or when I'm listening to any kind of a sound. And in fact, some composers do this. They will, there are pieces by composers where there will be an orchestra in front of you that you're listening to, but then there will be like backstage trumpets or people off to the side. And it creates this, and you experience this at the movies, right? Where there's speakers over there, and so you're perceiving sound coming from that space, but also from this space over here. So there's something having to do with space going on. Well, yes and no. Your perception of space, your auditory perception of space, is totally dependent on time in the following way. Here's how it works. And it's actually a very important ability that we have. Think about, imagine you're a caveman, 100,000 BC or whatever, and you're out in the savannah, I don't know, hunting and gathering, and you hear the roar of a saber-toothed tiger off in the distance. Which direction is it coming from? You can tell, and it's important to be able to tell, because if the tiger is over there, then it's important to run that way, and vice versa. So we need to have this ability to tell where sounds are coming from, and not even just right or left, but like off, off at an angle somehow. How are we able to do this? Do you ever think about this? How can we tell where sounds are coming from? It's very simple, and yet it's amazing. That saber-toothed tiger is over there roaring. The sound waves are coming towards me at something like, 760 miles an hour, the speed of sound waves through air, right? So those sound waves are coming at me awfully, awfully fast. They hit this ear first, and just a tiny fraction of a second later, I mean, think of the speed of sound, Mach 1. At Mach 1, that sound wave is going to hit this ear slightly later. And that's how I can tell. That's how my brain can tell that the sound is coming from that way. And the delay, of course, is going to be slightly different depending on the angle at which it's coming from. And this is why, for example, it's very difficult to tell with your eyes closed whether a sound is coming from directly in front of you or directly behind you, because your ears are on either side. And in that case, then it doesn't make a difference. If it's really directly in front of you or directly behind you, you can't tell, and you really need your visual context to be able to determine whether a sound is coming from directly in front or directly behind. Although also there could be echoes off of the walls or off of the trees in the forest or whatever it is that might assist with this. That means, by the way, if you lose the hearing in one ear, you can't really tell which direction sounds are coming from. Just like if you lose vision in one eye, you lose your depth perception, because that too is dependent on the light getting to one eye, or let's say the angle, the difference in angle of vision between one eye and the other. So there's a difference in time corresponding to the width of your head, and that's why we can tell where sounds are coming from. It's kind of an amazing thing. My point is that too is a manifestation of time. Right? So time is so fundamentally important in music that I think it's worth putting it there in the definition. An art based on the organization of sounds in time. Notice that there's no sort of judgment in this definition that the sounds have to be beautiful. They just have to be organized. They just have to be organized with some kind of an artistic intent. Right? And the sounds don't have to be produced by musical instruments either, or by the human voice. You could, for example, go to the store and turn on a bunch of different vacuum cleaners and determine the pitch that they're running at. Hear the sounds that they are making and say, you know what, I'm going to create a composition for an ensemble of vacuum cleaners. And you buy them all and you take them home and you figure out some system of turning them on and off at different times. You're organizing sound. You're using vacuum cleaners, and it might be not very pleasant music to listen to. It might be interesting to some people and not to other people, but it actually qualifies as music. Okay, let me look at another definition of music. This is how interesting this subject is to me. Maybe it isn't to you, but again, the idea of just taking a definition of a simple term like music and starting there it makes you think about it in ways that you maybe hadn't before. So what I have here is a book of essays, essentially, on the subject of aesthetics. You remember that word aesthetics from Lecture 0. That word appears in the syllabus because one of the things I said in the syllabus is that we're going to study the historical, philosophical, and aesthetic context from which this music that we're studying arose. And so aesthetics is just simply the study of beauty, of the phenomenon of beauty. And in this collection of essays on various subjects relating to beauty in the arts, we have an essay that looks to be about 8 or 10 pages long. The title of this essay is On the Concept of Music, and it's by a man named Gerald Levinson. And all he's trying to do in these 8 or 10 pages maybe it's 4 or 5 pages, is to come up with a decent definition of music. And in the end, he admits that he's not even really able to do it, that it's sort of like a good starting point. This essay starts with the question, we should, at the outset, distinguish the question, what is music, from some others with which it might be confused. One of these is the question of what kind of thing a piece of music is, that is to say, what ontological or metaphysical category it belongs to, and what its identity conditions are, etc., etc. So it goes on in this vein, discussing what qualifies as music, what doesn't, what we need in this definition, and what we might not require in this definition. I'm just going to cut to the chase here. I'm going to get to close to the end of the essay, where after about 4 or 5 pages, he arrives at a definition that he says is still a rough definition. He says, our complete definition of music would then go roughly like this. Music. Sounds temporarily organized, so organized in time. That's all that temporary means. It's that root tempus fugit, you might have heard, time flies. Anything that is temporary is existing in time. So sounds temporarily organized by a person. So I guess if it's not a person, it's not music, and that raises the question, well, how about birds singing? Does that qualify as music? Well, I don't know. Are those birds attempting to organize sounds artistically, or do they have some other purpose? Would it qualify as art, or is it more like communication? Is it more like speaking for the birds? You'd have to ask the bird. I don't know. Some birds can talk, so maybe you can ask a bird, ask an African gray parrot and see what they tell you. Anyway, sounds temporarily organized by a person for the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience. For the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience. So notice he says, he doesn't say for the purpose of expressing emotions, which I agree with. I think I can imagine music that doesn't necessarily intend to express emotions. And in fact, I think the earliest type of music that we study, once we get out of this unit on the elements of music and we get into our historical eras, we will study a type of music called Gregorian chant, fundamentally a very important type of music that was the repertoire of the Catholic Church all throughout the Middle Ages. And I would argue that the purpose of Gregorian chant is not really to express emotions, unless maybe that emotion would be reverence or piety. The purpose of Gregorian chant is to praise God, right? Not necessarily to cause any feelings on the part of the listener, unless maybe the listener being God, causing God to feel pleasure and gratitude or whatever it is, to feel that he has been praised sufficiently. But I don't think it's really meant to express emotion in the way that, let's say, the music that we might listen to on the radio is meant to express emotion. But it's hard to argue that the purpose of music doesn't have something to do with enriching or intensifying experience, right? That's a little broader than expressing emotions or creating a thing of beauty or whatever, right? Because again, I made the point that music doesn't necessarily have to be beautiful. It could be intentionally ugly, or maybe you just think that someone else's music is ugly when they think it's beautiful. It doesn't have to be beautiful to be music. But I think we could agree, at least I would agree with this, that music is created for the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience. But it goes on here. It says, so sounds temporarily organized by a person for the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience through active engagement, e.g., listening, dancing, performing, with the sounds regarded primarily or in significant measure as sounds. Right? So that's what I was talking about a little bit earlier, that in music, the sounds are regarded primarily as sounds, not as mere encoding devices, right? The way that the sounds that I'm making right now are really just encoding the more important part of language, which is the meaning. And this is why it's not really enough to say that music is the organization of sounds, and leave it at that. Because there's another art form that involves the organization of sounds, and that is spoken poetry. If I recite a poem to you, it uses sound, right? And I'm creating sounds, and there's hopefully some artistic intent. I might be trying to get sort of an emotional reaction. I'm trying to communicate something, trying to enrich an experience. But in spoken poetry, the sounds are not the most important thing. The meaning of the words is the most important thing. Now, obviously, some poets, most good poets, I think, will definitely consider the sounds of the words that they choose. And they might choose this word, but not that word, because they prefer the sound of one or the other. But they're not going to choose a word that has a completely different meaning just because they like the sound. Because then the whole system of language breaks down, because then the sounds don't correspond to meanings, and then it just becomes nonsense. It becomes just like a string of random pretty sounding words that don't mean anything, because the meaning that they're trying to encode just doesn't coalesce. So the sounds have to be regarded primarily, or in significant measure, as sounds, and not as merely encoders of meaning. But again, this is tricky because recall what I was doing with the C major and the C minor triad. One could argue that I'm sort of encoding meaning in there, as long as the person on the receiving end listening to it has grown up in the culture and understands the code. So the subject of meaning in music, and I've just been maintaining that music is essentially meaningless, that it doesn't convey specific meanings. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that I said it was meaningless. I said that it doesn't encode specific meanings. There could be general meanings, or there could be meanings that are contingent on who is listening to it. But this is kind of a controversial subject in music. And there have been great composers like Igor Stravinsky. I don't know if you've ever heard of Igor Stravinsky, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, who insisted that music was essentially meaningless, that instrumental music, purely sounds without a text there, was meaningless. And I think most people would probably take issue with that, but it's pretty hard to argue with. At least it's something that I think is interesting to debate, which is why I went into this whole thing on coming up with a definition of the word music. Anyway, I would say that, again, to repeat, if you're wondering, well, what's the definition going to be on the test? It's going to be the art of organizing or ordering sounds in time. So that's what music is. So now we can go on and talk about other aspects of music, and we really need to talk about sound, obviously. The book starts out talking about sound and only gets to this definition of music a little bit later. But we are now ready to start talking about sound. What is sound? I think we all have at least a vague idea. The book, fourth paragraph down, the word sound is there in bold print and italics, and it says, sound begins with the vibration of an object. I think we knew this, that when something starts vibrating, it can create a sound. It won't necessarily create a sound, but it can create a sound. It begins with the vibration of an object, such as a table that is pounded or a string that is plucked. The vibrations are transmitted to our ears by a medium. There has to be something through which those vibrations are moving from the table to our ears, or from the guitar string to our ears. There has to be a medium, which is usually air, right? And that's why in space, no one can hear you scream. There is no air in space. There's nothing to carry the sound. And that's why if you go to a movie like Star Wars or whatever, and there are spaceships going through that doesn't happen in space. Space is, of course, completely silent. If you want to see, by the way, a really excellent movie that deals with space and with music, and it has an amazingly sort of realistic depiction of space and this beautiful silence. Well, there's music in the background. I highly recommend the Stanley Kubrick movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Wonderful movie. There's great music in there, and it's also refreshing because you see these spaceships going through space, and not making sounds because that's how it happens. If there's an explosion in space, there's not going to be any sound. If you're on the outside, maybe if you're inside the Death Star where there's air, there's going to be sound, but not out in space. There has to be a medium. So what happens is if I pluck this guitar string over here, actually let me pick it up and show you. I don't play guitar, unfortunately, but when I pluck this guitar string, what is happening is the string is vibrating back and forth. That vibration is transferred via this strip here, which is called the bridge, right? If I just had a string and nothing to transmit that vibration, like if I just had a couple of like when you pluck a rubber band in the air, it's not very loud, and the reason for that is it's pushing some of the air back and forth. But what we need is to amplify. We need some sort of a speaker, right? It might not be an electronic speaker, but we need something to amplify, and I'll talk about what amplification is. It's kind of hard to even start to talk about music without using the terms, which I haven't defined yet. But what happens is this string starts vibrating back and forth many, many, many times per second. Those vibrations are pushing on the bridge. The bridge also vibrates many, many, many times per second. The vibrations then move to the body of the guitar. And the body of the guitar vibrates at that same exact speed. The air inside the guitar vibrates at that speed. And we've got a hole here, and the body of the guitar is essentially just a speaker, right? That's why, by the way, an electric guitar that doesn't have this big hollow body in the speaker, if you don't plug it in, it's very, very soft because all you're hearing is just the strings. You don't have this sort of amplification system of the body of the guitar. So anyway, the air in the guitar starts to vibrate. In fact, the air in the entire room starts to vibrate at the same speed that the string was vibrating. That vibration of the air causes my eardrums to vibrate at the same speed. Then there's a nerve on the other side of the eardrum that picks up on that vibration and transmits that information up to my brain and says, you are now hearing the note E, right? Or A, or whatever it is, right? So that's how sound works at a very fundamental level. We need to have vibrations in order to have sound. Now this leads to a kind of an interesting question. And that is, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, I don't know. Is the sound what you are perceiving in your head? Or is the sound out there in the world? Certainly the vibrations of the air are going to be just the same, whether someone is there to hear them or not. I don't know. You might say, well, there are vibrations but there aren't really sound, because sound is the sense that your brain is making of those vibrations. And I don't know, there could be aliens that have some sort of a different brain, some different way of picking up on sound waves that causes something else to happen in their brains instead of sort of hearing a sound. Maybe they see a color instead. Who knows? Maybe they smell a smell or taste a taste. So we need to have vibrations in order to have sound. Sound and vibration are not exactly the same thing. I would say that sounds are caused by vibrations. All right. Now, there are, I would say, two fundamental categories, two different types of sound for our purposes in this course. Okay. So you've got sound here and then two different types of sound. One type of sound I would call tones or pitches. These are sounds that are caused by some regular rate of vibration. The vibrations are happening at a steady rate. If we have one individual note, like that E on the guitar, I'm not sure what frequency that would be, but I know what this one on the piano would be. I have a little electric piano in front of me that you can't see. And this is the A above middle C. And it just so happens that this A corresponds to 440 cycles per second. That is, when I push down on this A, there's a tone generator inside. This isn't a real piano, it's an electronic piano. So there's a tone generator. There are speakers The speakers start moving back and forth 440 times every second. The air in the room starts moving back and forth 440 times every second. My eardrums move back and forth. And I recognize the note A, all right? Another way of saying cycles per second or vibrations per second is Hertz, named after a German scientist who studied sound back in the 19th century. So it's sometimes abbreviated HZ, 440 hertz. It just means cycles per second. Right? That's a pitch, A. We might also say it is a tone. That sound qualifies as a tone because the vibrations are regular. Now, they could be faster or slower, but as long as they're moving at some steady rate where you could like match the pitch with your voice, like, right, then it's a tone. The other fundamental type of sound is a noise. So noise has a technical definition. It's not just like sounds that we don't like, or sounds that are ugly or whatever, or sounds that are random. Well, in a way they're random. Noises are sounds, the technical definition of a noise is a sound that is not caused by a regular vibration, but by irregular vibrations, disordered vibrations. Maybe the rate of vibration is changing so often that you can't get a fix on it. Or maybe there are so many vibrations going on at once that it doesn't coalesce into a tone or to a chord that is a combination of tones. Right? So we've got tones, which we might also refer to as pitches, basically mean the same thing. And then we've got noises. Now, both tones and noises are useful in music, are used in music. Remember, music is the organization of sound, not just tones. And there are a lot of musical instruments, especially the percussion instruments, that produce noises that don't produce tones, like the snare drum or the cymbal or the bass drum. There are other percussion instruments, as we will see when we get into talking about the different families of instruments, the different types of percussion instruments. There are pitched percussion instruments and there are non-pitched. The non-pitched produce noises, and the pitched produce tones or pitches. So both sound and noise are useful in music, right? But obviously, we're going to probably talk more about tones, right? What can we say about noises? They are sort of random, disorganized, chaotic vibrations or sounds that are caused by those kinds of vibrations. Much more can be said about tones. And in Western music anyway, we use a lot more tones than we do noises. So there's a lot more going on there, a lot more to cover. And what the book does is they start with pitch, highness or lowness of sound. And remember, there is no high or low, really. They could be graphed high or low, like they could be written on a piece of music high or low, so we know to play this note and this note, but they could just as easily be turned around. There's nothing inherently high or low about notes. If I play a quote-unquote high note on the guitar, the sound waves aren't just up there. They're filling the whole room, right? Just as the low notes are. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I should talk about waves a little bit. You're familiar with waves on the ocean, and some of you maybe have taken a physics class. You're familiar with waveforms that are often represented like two-dimensionally. But the sound waves, the waves that are moving through the air, are pressure waves that are moving in 3 dimensions. And what they really are the sound, the molecules in the air, as the sound wave goes through them, become sort of like more compressed here and then more spread out there. And that compressed area moves through the spread out area, right? And it moves kind of in all directions. Another way to think about waves, by the way, is if you've seen people do the wave in a stadium, right? People stand up and sit down. And what is interesting about the wave in a stadium, and is also true of sound waves, is also true of waves on the ocean, is the people are standing up and sitting down, and the wave is moving perpendicular. So the people are going up and down. The people aren't moving. The wave is moving, but the medium, the individual people, are not moving in the same way that the wave is. They're going up and down. The wave is moving at a right angle. Same is true with waves in the ocean, which are more or less two-dimensional. Think of the ocean as a two-dimensional plane. Okay, the surface of the ocean is a two-dimensional plane. And the individual water droplets, when a wave is coming in, until the wave breaks on the shore, at least, the waves out in the ocean, the water molecules are mostly going up and down. As the wave goes this way, it's just like the wave in a stadium. You just have to picture little water molecules instead of people, right? The water molecule goes up and then it goes back down. And as that happens over trillions of water molecules, the wave moves at a right angle, right? So kind of a fascinating thing about waves. We can, although sound waves are three-dimensional, they are pressure waves with more compressed and more rarefied regions of air. We can understand them a little bit more easily if we think of good old two-dimensional waves, like with an x and a y axis, right? That you might graph, like waveforms in a math class. Okay. On the, I guess it would be the x-axis. Doesn't really matter whether I call them x or y. I was never very good at math. I never took those advanced math classes. But we have two axes, right? The horizontal and the vertical, x and y. And we can picture a wave, right? And we can even describe that wave mathematically, right? Well, with sound waves, what we have a certain amount of energy that is imparted into, let's see, banging on the table or plucking the string. Some energy is imparted into some matter, causing it to vibrate, right? Those vibrations have a frequency and they have an amplitude. The frequency is simply how fast, how many times per second the medium, the wood, the guitar string, and then the air, and then my eardrum, how many times per second it is moving through a cycle, right? A cycle of up and down. A cycle is a complete motion of up and back down to where it was, right? That's the frequency. There's also an amplitude. The amplitude is the height of the wave, the amount of energy that the wave has, which is a separate function from its frequency, right? So if I pluck this guitar very hard, no, that wasn't very hard. I didn't want to knock it over. All right? It's louder because I imparted more energy to it. I struck the string harder. I could strike it much more gently. It's making the exact same pitch. It's just not as loud. It doesn't have as much amplitude. That's like the height of the wave, all right? If I touch a higher string, now I'm going to get a higher frequency. I say again, higher. It's not really higher. It's a higher frequency. It's a higher number. This string is corresponding to a vibration that is happening more frequently in time, right? That's the frequency. How often the waves are happening in time. And you can picture yourself, let's say, at the beach. You go to the beach and you observe waves rolling in, right? You could sit there with a stopwatch and count like, okay, we're getting 10 waves per minute. That's the frequency. But if it's a calm day, they might just be little ripples. They're not very big waves. If it's a very windy day, and that's where waves come from, by the way, it's just from water being pushed by the wind. So if it's a very windy day and you've got big, energetic waves that'll knock you over, they have more amplitude, right? And they are two independent functions. So in music, or let's say with tones, the pitch, the high or low of a tone is dependent on its frequency. The volume, the loud or soft of a sound, is dependent on its amplitude, right? How much energy, the height of that wave. Is it like a tsunami or is it just a little ripple? Okay. So those are the first two fundamental aspects of sound. Now there's an awful lot more going on with sound than just that. That's a very simplified picture, right? We're going to get into some of the complexities of sound waves as we talk about tone quality next time. And then we'll get into talking about different pitches and how they relate to each other, the mathematical ratios that are at work in the relationships between pitches. We call those intervals. Right? So I'll assign some reading for you to read about that stuff, and then we'll talk about it in the next lecture. All right? Okay, I'll see you then.